Once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, it's an honor for me to be part of the World IE 2021, the International Integrated Energy Show, and also to chair this session on the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Being part of this theme, energy transitions and progressive decarbonization of power, I share my perspective, but I'm more keen to hear from all of you, my esteemed panelists, co-panelists, what's your take on this particular important subject? We all agree that it could not have been more appropriate at this particular moment in time in history to deliberate on this theme as the world is acting on an aggressive action plan towards achievement of sustainable goals. Globally, the governments, the industry, diaspora, think tanks have all decisively converged towards accelerating the energy transition. India, on its own, has been at the forefront in setting a direction with a global vision amidst apprehensions of economic viability of deploying clean energy sources at scale. India was among the countries to achieve grid parity for solar hybrid projects and round-the-clock power at an early stage. I'm sure India will remain an important stakeholder in this global energy transition roadmap. Carbon capture, utilization and storage, CCUS as we all call it, will need to form a key pillar of efforts to put on the world on the path to net zero emissions. A net zero energy system requires a profound transformation in how we produce and use energy that can only be achieved with a broad suite of technologies. Alongside renewables, hydrogen, and sustainable bioenergy, CCUS will need to play a major role towards decarbonization. It is the only group of technologies that contributes to both the reducing emissions in the key sectors directly and to removing CO2 to balance emissions that cannot be avoided, a critical part of the net zero goals. At this juncture, personally, I would like to also share with all of you that L&T, the organization that I belong to, has committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040 and is also committed to integrate its ESG goals within its business targets. Meeting climate and energy goals requires a fundamental and accelerated transformation of the power systems globally. Decision makers collectively must support a rapid shift to low carbon generation while meeting strong growth in power demand, driven by increased energy access and affordability in developing economies and electrification of end-use sectors. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies can play an instrumental role in transformation in three basic ways. That's the way how I look at it. Retrofitting carbon capture technologies is an important solution to avoid the lock-in of the emissions from the vast fleet of existing fossil fuel power plants, while also providing plant owners with an asset protection strategy for recent investments. This is of particular relevance in Asia, where the average age of coal-fired power plants is just about 12 years. Number two, increasing variable renewable generation requires reliable and dispatchable energy for the flexibility and resource adequacy. While batteries and other forms of energy storage are being further developed and deployed, but carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies are also part of a portfolio of low carbon technologies, which are able to meet the growing need for flexibility, both manage the short term as well as the seasonal variations. These strategies offer a technological hedge against the innovation's uncertainty in the power system transformation. Number three, through its combination with bioenergy, carbon capture technologies can enable negative emission power plants, which can be critical for offsetting emissions in harder to abate sectors like steel and cement, and to support net zero climate goals. Why we are talking about the importance of CCUS in power sector? We all know that power plants are fueled by either coal and gas, which continue to dominate the global electric sector. They account for almost 2/3 of the power generation. Coal remains by far the largest fuel source for power generation at 38%, followed by gas at about 20%. And power is the largest carbon emitter in the energy sector, creating almost 40% of the global energy-related emissions at 13.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide, while in India, power sector alone accounts for almost 1.1 gigaton of carbon dioxide of the total 2.6 gigatons of CO2 that's emitted every year. Despite the rapid expansion of renewable energy generation, the sheer scale of the current power sector emissions and the vital role of the electrification means that countries must urgently tackle their emission from power to meet these global climate change. In effect, the power sector has to dramatically reduce its carbon intensity. To meet climate goals, policymakers need to address emissions from existing coal-fired power plants and those being built today. Yet, under current policy stated by the government globally, CO2 emissions from the existing coal-fired fleet would decline by approximately 40%, whereas annual emissions would still amount to about 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year up till 2040. Then, how do we support the energy transition with CCOS? I just spoke about the average, a very relative young age. So we have to tackle the emissions from existing plants in the Asian region, flexibility for power plants. Many regions have growing shares of power from variable renewables, driving a greater need for flexibility to ensure a stable operation of the power system. CCUS equipped power plants can provide this extra flexibility across broad timescales, ranging from the very short time, grid services, inertia, frequency, ancillary services, to a very long-term seasonal variations. And the third we just spoke about was the net zero and negative emissions, the long-term value of carbon capture technologies to the power systems and the energy system as a whole may further increase in line with the ambitious climate goals due to its ability to enable negative emissions from power generation when combined with bioenergy. When we talk about CCUS, what is the technology readiness that we are talking about? I'm sure we'll be hearing more of it from the panelists who are more into the details, but briefly among the technologies, we know that the chemical absorption, adsorption, membrane, chemical looping, microbiological, electrochemical, all of these are there, while chemical absorption based carbon capture technology is being deployed at larger scale due to its high TRL levels, especially in low pressure exhaust systems. Whereas on the other hand, adsorption based capture tech systems also look promising with advancements on adsorption materials with a higher capture densities. Where's the landscape for the utilization? CO2 utilization is receiving increasing interest from the scientific community. This is partly due to the climate change considerations and partly because CO2 as a feedstock can result in a cleaner production process compared with using conventional hydrocarbons. Utilization pathways could be CO2-based chemical products, including polymers, methanol, ethanol, microalgae-based fuels, concrete building materials, enhanced oil recovery, bioenergy, and carbon capture and storage. What's the development scenario that we are looking at? The sustainable development scenario. We believe that by 2040, 315 gigawatts of electricity generation capacity will be equipped with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This is equivalent to about adding retrofit of newly built CCUS capacity about 15 gigawatt per year on an average for the next 2 decades. Annual spending on fossil fuel plants equipped with carbon capture technologies may almost rise by $30 billion per year, with most of this increase coming in the second half of the outlook period of the 2040 that we are talking about. After years of slow progress and insufficient investments, interest in CCUS is starting to grow. Plans for more than 30 commercial facilities have been announced in the last 3 years globally. Projects are now nearing a final investment decision, represent an estimated potential of about $27 billion, more than double the investment plan in 2017. This portfolio of projects is increasingly diverse, including power generation, cement and hydrogen facilities, and industrial hubs, and would double the level of CO2 captured globally from what is being captured around 40 million tons today. Going forward, the amount of CO2 capture, utilization, and storage is expected to grow exponentially with the support of government and the ecosystem. So finally, what are we looking at the policy support from the powers to be, and how the policymakers can accelerate the low carbon transition by policies that can promote carbon capture technologies in power generation. CCUS deployment will rely on such policymakers who can make or take action to give direction to utilities and investors. Broadly, 5. Now, 1, capital support, including grants and provisions from government or state-owned enterprises. Grant funding was instrumental in the early development of the carbon capture technologies in power, with Boundary Dam receiving about $170 million from the Canadian government, Petronova benefiting almost $200 million from the United States Department of Energy. Number 2, public procurement, where the government is involved directly or indirectly in the project, including through contracts to purchase power from CCUS equipped plants. This approach may be particularly relevant in countries or regions with state-owned energy utilities, including Asia and also like countries like India. Number 3, tax credits, such as Section 45Q tax credits in the United States, which provide for $50 per ton of CO2 for dedicated geological storage, or almost $35 per ton of CO2 for use of CO2 in enhanced oil recovery. Number 4, regulatory standards and obligations, such as a regulated asset-based model where costs are passed on to customers, or tradable carbon capture certificates associated with the CO2 storage obligation. In the case of tradable certificates, the government would issue them to project operators based on the CO2 stored, while the other parties, the emitters, would be obliged to buy them. 5th and the last, operational subsidies, such as a contract for different mechanisms that can cover the cost differential between the higher cost of generation and the market price. So these are my just initial thoughts. I know there are lots of other things that my co-panelists will be adding. Wonderful to have all of you here. Thank you so much. And I think we can start with the first panelist. I think Ms. Gay Win E. Quems. I think I'll just give you a brief introduction about you, madam, and then possibly I'll request you to start. Ms. Gay Win has led a career at the leading edge of energy and business. And with a background in chemistry and geology, she spent 15 years as a commissioning and reliability engineer at the nuclear power plants, before leading rapid application development and professional software services in the e-commerce, nuclear and smart grid sectors. She has spoken widely about the promise of CO2 utilization to solve some of the most pressing problems facing us today. And we will have her speak on the subject of converting waste CO2 into commercially viable carbon. All yours,